When we see a security guard at the bank, we all know that they are there to prevent people from stealing from that bank. But the guard that I'll be talking about today was so good that he actually prevented the bank itself from stealing from Holocaust victims. This is the story of Christoph Meili. Now, unfortunately, I can't really mention Christoph again until about halfway through this video, as I really need to explain the background of what was going on at Switzerland at the time, just to give his actions some context, so I'll begin. So we all know that Nazi Germany did some pretty horrendous things in the 1930s and the 1940s. But something that is not quite as widely known is that Nazi Germany did the biggest robbery in the history of humankind, as they plundered the wealth from all of their victims, both big and small. On the larger side of his victims, there were the entire gold reserves of the Netherlands, Austria, Belgium, and Czechoslovakia. But they also plundered from an individual level as well, meaning that they took anything of value from the victims of the death camps. And amongst these victims included Jews, gays, and people who worshipped religions that are not approved by the Nazi regime. And so after this incredible theft had taken place, Nazi Germany needed to both be able to trade this gold, and they also needed to be able to securely store it. And so they sent a large portion of this stolen gold to be stored safely in Switzerland, who, as we all know, were officially a neutral country during this war. Anyway, a few years later, the war is won and Nazi Germany was defeated. And it can be stated that when this happened, many Swiss bankers were kind of hoping that everyone would kind of just forget about the Nazi gold deposits that had been placed in their banks. Out of all these deposits that Switzerland are holding for Nazi Germany, there are two types of deposits in particular that really did raise some ethical concerns. The first one being the gold that had been stolen from Holocaust victims. And the second type of deposits that really raised some ethical concerns for these Swiss banks were the accounts that were in the names of those who had been murdered in the Holocaust. Now, in a normal setting, this would not be such a difficult issue, because normally the descendants of a person who owns a deceased account can just provide proof. However, in these Nazi death camps, unfortunately, they were not issuing out death certificates. So with this being the case, and for the deposits that had held to people who had most likely been murdered in these camps, there was a couple of issues. One being that how do you know that the person coming forward actually is a descendant of that deceased person? And two, how do we even actually know for sure that the person is actually deceased? And both the international community and the Swiss agreed that this is a bit of a problem. And so they came to an agreement. And this was made in Washington in 1946. Now, this allowed for $60 million to be distributed to victims and their families. And there was a modification to this agreement in 1962 that mandated that these Swiss banks flag inactive accounts that had belonged to European Jews and had not been touched since before the war. And so this freed up another $15 million, but despite the success of these two agreements, it is widely believed by many in the international community that the Swiss banks were actually holding back a little bit. And when I say a little bit, I mean quite a lot. And one case in particular really stood out, and this was from an American Holocaust survivor by the name of Greta Beer. So her father was a very wealthy Jewish-German textile manufacturer, and he had a bank account in Switzerland. And after decades of attempts, she could not access the wealth that was stored in that account. And this is partly due to the lack of a death certificate. So then she decided to try and sue the Swiss bank to actually access the money from that account. And this is the point where she realized that she was the last thing from being alone in this struggle. As it turns out that there was many Holocaust victims' descendants who were in the exact same boat. So they teamed up with each other and launched a joint committee to represent them all against all of the Swiss banks. And the investigation was ramping up, and they were finding new bits of evidence that had never been uncovered before. And one really damning piece of evidence was the fact that the Swiss used 280 of their own trucks to drive into Nazi Germany, pick up 100 tons of gold, and then drive it back to Switzerland for safekeeping. And out of this 100 tons, also just bear in mind, the Swiss had only compensated for the equivalent of 4 tons before this evidence was brought to the surface. And other bits of evidence that surfaced that were a bit less dramatic but still quite numerous included stolen artworks, eyewitness accounts that Jewish asylum seekers had been turned away at the Swiss border, and proof that free labour from the work camps had been used to benefit Swiss companies, and one of those Swiss companies being Nestle. So now that's all the background covered, and now I can get back to telling the actual story of this incredible security guard, Christoph. So it seems like a very boring night in January 1997, where Christoph gets ready for work and he arrives at the UBS bank for his typical night shift. And upon doing his patrol rounds, he saw bank staff destroying depositor records. And the reason that UBS was destroying the paperwork origins of these depositor accounts was because that they truly believed them to be orphaned assets. And what an orphan asset is that not only did the depositor die in the Holocaust, but also all of the depositor's children and grandchildren, and therefore no one would be ever likely to step forward to try and make a claim to those assets. And the documents in question were deposits that belonged to European Jews, and they were dated between 1897 to 1927. So when no one was looking, Christoph Meili took some of these documents that were meant to be destroyed, and then forwarded them through to a Swiss Jewish organization. And then they then forwarded it through to the police and the media, along with Christoph's eyewitness account of how UBS Bank were destroying these records. And although the actions that UBS Bank were doing was highly illegal, unfortunately Christoph himself had also broken some Swiss laws on banking secrecy by smuggling these depositor records away from the bank. And so as the old saying goes, no good deed goes unpunished. And so when all of this was made public, Meili, along with his family, was the recipient of numerous death threats, and he is criminally charged with breaking these Swiss banking secrecy laws. But Christoph knew that he had done the right thing, and that he wasn't a criminal, as the Swiss media are portraying him to be. And so he applied for political asylum in the United States, and it was granted. And so, to this day, Christoph and his family are the only Swiss nationals in history to ever be granted political asylum in the United States. But yep, this actually happened, and so with this you can basically piece together that Christoph made some pretty powerful enemies, but fortunately his actions also made him some pretty powerful friends. So meanwhile, now I'll switch back to the legal fight that was going on with the World Jewish Council versus the Swiss banks. So this evidence was used alongside Christoph's eyewitness account that UBS were destroying depositor records. And with Christoph's evidence, along with a lot of other evidence that was provided from a few other sources, the World Jewish Council was able to settle with the Swiss banks to the tune of $1.25 billion, and this was in January 1998. And another thing about this settlement is that UBS had to agree to drop their criminal charges against Christoph Meili and also compensate him for $750,000 for the amount of stress and trauma that he'd caused to him and his family. And on top of this as well, UBS agreed to donate $40 million to the International Red Cross as a gesture of good faith and to show that they actually were remorseful for their actions. And so from here, it looks like that the World Jewish Council had a very big win. But this entire situation had been incredibly hard for Christoph and his family. And as a result of this, in February 2002, his marriage ended in divorce as the rest of his family moved back to Switzerland. And in 2003, he went back to Switzerland to visit his family, but he found that he was a very polarizing figure in his home country, meaning that either thought that he was a dead set hero, which he rightfully is, or there was unfortunately still a lot of Swiss nationals that thought he was a villain as well, and so he couldn't be comfortable in his own country anymore. So anyway, he went back to the United States and he remarried. But unfortunately in 2009 that marriage ended as well, and at this point he actually moved back to Switzerland properly and permanently, after he had sort of mostly been forgotten about. So although he did an incredibly great noble action here, unfortunately things didn't really play out for him in the long run, which I think is probably the most tragic thing about this story. And to this day there can be a bit of a reasonable argument made to say that Swiss banks are actually putting in a lot more of an honest and legitimate effort to try and uncover what was looted treasures and overturn them to the victims of, or the descendants of the victims. And the Swiss Bankers Association have even started a humanitarian fund for the victims and the families of the Holocaust. But whether they're just doing this for good public relations or whether there's a legitimate heartfelt effort, it's a little bit hard to tell, but at least some steps have been made in the right direction. And that now brings us to today. And if we look at all these Swiss banks united today, they hold roughly about $6.5 trillion in assets. And out of that $6.5 trillion, we have no legitimate way of knowing what percentage of that was from Nazi looted treasures. Although with that being said though, the Swiss banks already were pretty big before the events of World War II, so although it would be a percentage, it probably won't be a massive percentage. As per usual, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.